I have no idea what I'm doing. That's the overall thesis of this video. There's a whole lot of informative, in-depth, and really knowledgeable Diablo 4 content out there right now, and if that's what you're looking for, you should probably back out right now, because I can pretty much promise that this video is not going to be that. Because what you'll find here is not intricate build breakdowns from an experienced player, or a deep dive into the lore of Diablo's world, or even a guide for how to get started with the game, but really quite the opposite. What you'll find here is a detailed record of what exactly Diablo 4 is like for a complete beginner. Over the last 21 days, I've put 40 hours into the game, logging information and taking notes each day in what turned out to be a bit of a Diablo 4 diary. In this video, I'm going to walk you through my experiences during that time, including observations, critiques, and feedback, but also learning experiences and moments of realization as I make my way through an entirely new world. It'll be kind of part review, part analysis, and part just me stumbling through unfamiliar systems. In doing so, I'm hoping to put into words what a lot of other players are experiencing right now, especially as this new entry into the series has blasted onto the scene and become many people's first experience with Diablo. I should make it clear at least that I'm not someone who has just completely avoided this series over its long lifespan. I've sampled parts of it through entry points like the Diablo 3 demo and one of the Diablo 2 Resurrected betas, but I've never had an experience with any of the games last more than a couple of hours. There's obviously something there that's made me want to try them out, but every attempt at exposing myself to a Diablo game just never materialized, whether because of a lack of knowledge, poor timing, or various other reasons. And it's not just the Diablo series that fell into this pattern for me. I've had similar experiences with games like Torchlight, Path of Exile, and Grim Dawn, playing each for a few hours before realizing that they weren't going to stick for me. A lot of these failed attempts I attribute to the fact that when you are a beginner at this style of action RPG, you really feel like a beginner. That's a bit of a puzzling thing to say because the gameplay framework found in these games is about as basic as they come. They are the embodiment of point-and-click action. But the depth of systems behind them and the abundance of content they contain can be incredibly intimidating and exhausting for a new player. Because of that, it really feels like the only way to truly learn the game and dive deeper than just the surface-level enjoyment of its action combat is to sink a lot of time into it and figure things out with a completely fresh start. So after years of showing interest in an entire subgenre of games, but never an ability to truly dive into them, I've been waiting for an opportunity to do so. And now, with the release of Diablo 4, I think that opportunity has finally arrived. So right off the bat, I want to point out some obvious limitations that this video is going to have. Number one, this should go without saying, but I feel like I have to emphasize the fact that this video is not for you if you're expecting high-level analysis of Diablo 4 and its many intricacies involving builds, gear, progression, endgame content, etc. I'll be talking about those things, but I cannot overstate how much you probably should not listen to my advice. Number two, I fully recognize that 40 hours is a minuscule number compared to the hundreds and sometimes thousands of hours other players have been known to put into this series. But as a total beginner, it felt like a pretty good jumping off point to offer some perspective. Number three, all of my time so far has been spent playing one class and playing solo, no groups or partners at all. As such, I'm obviously only offering insight into the Barbarian class and what the experience is like playing alone. This was a deliberate decision, as it felt wiser to focus in on a single class rather than bounce around between the others in an attempt to really learn its mechanics and to progress deeper into the main game, without assistance from anyone else. Which leads into number four. I will not be following any sort of guide or really using any references at all while I play. I wanted to experience the true learning curve of the game and make mistakes along the way. It's likely I'll touch on topics and issues that sound obvious to seasoned Diablo players. It's also possible that I may just straight up get some things wrong due to not fully understanding certain systems in the game. If that's the case, feel free to politely leave a comment letting me know what's up. And I guess lastly, there will obviously be some spoilers for the game, though really nothing noteworthy. This whole video focuses more on the experience of what it's like to play the game and not anything specific to the story or late game content or anything like that. I'll be discussing a couple of specific side quests, and you'll see some footage of bosses or special gear, but it's likely you won't even notice. So with all that said, I can see this video really being for 3 types of people. Other players who are complete beginners to the Diablo series and or maybe thinking about jumping in for the first time, people who love Diablo or this style of action RPG in general and enjoy hearing about as many perspectives on them as possible, and Diablo veterans who want to re-experience the feeling of playing the series for the first time, something that unfortunately becomes more and more distant the more time we put into a particular game. And with that, our journey begins as we find ourselves waking up in a snowy cave on the outskirts of a mysteriously creepy town. Okay, so I've actually been lying to you this whole time. I did actually play one of the betas for Diablo 4 for a little while, so I have experienced the game's introduction before. But I have to say, I think it's great. Things start out almost elementarily basic, roaming a snow-covered environment and pointing on a handful of wolves to learn the combat. I mean, even for a total beginner like myself, the start to the game is incredibly simple, but I think we have to remember that there are new players who are going to be exposed to this game who know even less than I do, so this sequence has to be included. And the developers did a good job of keeping it short and not full of unnecessary interrupting tutorials, though those pop-ups are present if you leave them turned on. But the part of the intro that I think is really great is actually the story aspect and the way it introduces you to Diablo's world. You stumble across this small village with citizens in need of help, and they quickly recruit you to solve their demon-slaying problems, a theme that predictably will be present throughout pretty much the entire game.
I will cleanse the old ruins of evil.
But after you answer their call by working your way through your first dungeon, the villagers turn on you, putting into motion the mechanism that moves forward the entire plot of Diablo 4. This sequence was, at least to me, unexpected, but more importantly, it immediately teaches us a very important lesson about this game, and that is that the world of Sanctuary is unforgiving, it is dark, and it is joyless. Rarely anything ever goes right, its inhabitants are in a constant state of stress, there is evil lurking around every corner. And as bad as a group of villagers attempting to sacrifice you to the Daughter of Hatred sounds, well, sleep with one eye open because it's not about to get any more pleasant. Of course, this is simply our prologue, a very minor taste of what's to come in combat, storyline, and exploration. And as I soon learned, there is a lot of all 3 of those things in Diablo 4. Our first true stop on the journey is one of the game's main hub cities, Kyovashad of the Fractured Peaks. Okay, but let's stop there and back up a bit, because some of you may have noticed that I skipped over a hugely important part of any Diablo game, and that is selecting your class of hero. So let's jump back to the game's initial campfire screen, which, although is not quite as good as the character selection scene from 1080 snowboarding, it still gets the job done. Diablo 4 at launch has 5 distinct classes available to choose from. One of the only bits of research I did before starting this game was taking a look at which class might be best for my level of experience and my playstyle. And honestly, results were all over the place, which really is probably a good thing, because it means that all 5 classes can be legitimately enjoyed by both casual and hardcore players alike. In the end, I landed on the Barbarian. To me, it seemed like the class that had the most straightforward mechanics in the form of basically be a big dude and swing shit at enemies. Should be simple enough. I want to note that I was pretty much equally intrigued by all of the classes present here, as even just reading a short description and examples of skills, I could tell that a lot of work was put into making them unique. More on that later, but for now, I chose my Barbarian, customized his look a little, and started my first game. Throughout the beginning stages of the game, this choice felt like a good one. When your primary form of dealing damage is running at enemies and slapping them with swords, axes, and maces, it leaves open some brainpower to focus on some of the other combat mechanics that I wasn't as familiar with. One of the Barbarian's defining features is its arsenal, which allows you to equip up to 4 weapons and assign them to different attacks. This can add some interesting decisions as you unlock certain skills later on, but fortunately the game will default to auto-assigning these selections, making the system much more user-friendly to beginners who aren't ready to tackle it yet. The Barbarian also has a really intuitive resource management system. Their special abilities pull from a pool of Fury, that orange orb on the right side of the UI, and you gain Fury typically by using your basic attacks. So the general combat loop with the barbarian is to engage enemies, use basic attacks to build up some fury, then tap into that resource to unleash a more specialized and often more effective core attack. It's an easy to understand system that, as we'll see later, still manages to stay engaging even after dozens of hours using it. The early game is relatively limiting on what you have access to as far as your attacks go, which is a good thing. And that's a testament to a skill tree that promotes experimentation and variety while curbing an ultimately vast amount of options that can be overwhelming to a new player. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get back to our task at hand and see what thoughts were running through my head during my first week in Sanctuary. Can I just say, what a boss move by the developers for starting the game in a snowy area? Anyone who's a true gamer can tell you that you don't use the snow and ice level archetype till at least the second or third section of the game. So I think it's appropriate for us to call Diablo 4 a serious trailblazer in this area. For real though, I don't know how the other games in the Diablo series begin, but this was legitimately a bold choice to start the player off in this environment. When you think about a game that's built around fighting demons from hell, the snowy tundras of Fractured Peaks are not the first thing you think of, but this environment is just as oppressive visually and contains enemies just as brutal as any other area found in the game. The city of Kyovashad is at the heart of this region, and although its dreary and drab aesthetic doesn't exactly feel warm and cozy, it oddly becomes a place of comfort over time as you spend more and more time fighting monsters and demons in the vast environments that encompass it. There's a few tutorial-like quests found here, as well as some story setup that you have to complete, but really it's the first time you leave Kyovashad to enter its unforgiving surroundings that you can pinpoint as the exact moment when Diablo 4 really begins. One of the main pieces of hype throughout this game's development has been its implementation of a deliberately designed open world, one that serves as a massive hub for the game's countless dungeons and activities. And the moment you first step foot into this world, you can feel the game open up around you. By the time you get to this point, you already have a couple of quest markers you can start making your way towards, or you can just start roaming. Likely what ends up happening is a combination of both, which to me is one of the defining features of a great open world game. It's funny because I remember there being a lot of lead-up discussion about Diablo 4 turning to this type of design, but as a newcomer, I pretty much immediately thought to myself, how else would you build this game? There are some open world games out there that probably would have been better off going with a more linear direction, and there are others that simply follow the open world trend because that's where the industry seems to have settled. I can tell you right now that Diablo 4 is not one of those games. The game's enormous map serves as a do-it-your-way connector for its campaign missions and its plentiful dungeons, but also contains a seemingly constant stream of side quests that are housed within the overworld itself. As I continued exploring and discovering more and more of the map, it became clear that Diablo 4's campaign is designed in a way that opens up the world as you choose it to. This design choice, along with the fact that the game's enemies scale to your character's level, means that you really can go where you want, when you want. Because certain missions and even full acts in Diablo 4 often do not need to be completed in a specific order, the way you choose to approach the campaign dictates the way the world opens up to you. An approach that I imagine lends itself really well to multiple playthroughs, as it's unlikely you'll ever explore this map the same way twice. So the amount of content that you're exposed to off the bat is impressive, and as you begin roaming the initial Fractured Peaks region, you quickly run into the true hallmark of the Diablo series. It's frantic but strategic action combat that works in conjunction with its loot system. Combat in Diablo 4 begins with a very basic structure that gradually ramps up in complexity thanks to the game's progressively compounding skill tree. My first reaction upon opening that skill tree is that it is large but not overwhelming. After a few minutes of studying it, I could at least get a grasp on its flow, though I had no idea yet how the skills would end up interacting with one another or how to use them to create a viable build. Skills are separated into different categories, with each cluster lining up in a linear fashion and requiring a total number of applied skill points to unlock. So for my barbarian character, I have to spend points in basic skills before I can unlock any core skills, then start adding points to either of these first two clusters before I can unlock defensive skills, then brawling skills, and so on. You are not necessarily required to have points allocated to any particular set of talents to unlock the next cluster, so long as you've spent the necessary total number of skill points somewhere. This structure simultaneously provides the player with immediate choices on how to build their character, but also protects them from biting off more than they can chew too early on into the experience. But even with these training wheels on during the early stages of the game, it becomes apparent how much fun some of these combinations of skills can be. Something as simple as the lunge strike, a basic attack that quickly dashes you towards an enemy, combined with the spinning ferocity of a whirlwind attack dealing damage to a larger area, can be really satisfying to see in action. And there are more than ample opportunities to test and refine these combinations, as you'll encounter endless enemies everywhere you go. It was around the 10-hour mark that I noted starting to really get a feel for my current build and different movesets, noticing several moments during combat when I was able to get into a flow of anticipating what I was going to do next and how I was going to chain attacks together throughout an encounter. Looking back now, these are the moments when Diablo 4 feels at its best, and although this experience lost some of its luster as time went on, there were still moments up to the end of my 40 hours that I still noticed this feeling. In a move perhaps intended by the developers, it was also around this time frame when I actually started putting some effort into experimenting with my build, removing certain skills and adding others to see how they would interact with one another. As I mentioned before, I went into this game without looking up any builds or guides on how to set up a character, and although this was part of what intimidated me going into the game, I cannot stress enough how much I think this approach is the best choice for new players. Experimenting with and constantly manipulating your skill tree in an attempt to find a combination of moves that really synergize with your playstyle is one of the best parts of Diablo 4. Certainly there were times when I would nearly reset my whole build and try to center it around one particular feature, only to find that the combinations I chose either weren't really satisfying for me to play with, or just flat out didn't work well. For example, relatively early on, I tried switching to a build that focused on bleeding damage, but found that the damage over time mechanic didn't really suit my playstyle, as I preferred dealing with enemies the precise moment I wanted to and finishing them off on direct terms. Because of the sheer amount of enemies you'll encounter in Diablo 4, the game gives you more than enough opportunities to test inefficiencies, and ultimately builds become a lesson on experimentation, teaching us that failure is okay and trial and error is a valid way to have fun. The reason this works so well in Diablo 4 specifically is because of how surprisingly accessible the game is. The framework of the combat is straightforward, the complexities of it are generally ramped up at an appropriate pace, and most importantly, the player is given the choice of how much they actually want to dive into those complexities and when they want to do so. And it's because of those features that I felt empowered enough to try my own thing, to see what worked and what didn't, and to modify it as I saw fit. Now, maybe this feeling will change as I get deeper into the game, or as I increase the difficulty and simply need a build that maximizes effectiveness, but at this stage, I think this aspect of the game has been handled pretty well. So up to this point, I've been referring to builds specifically in the context of the game's skill tree and the combinations of attacks, buffs, and movements you'll utilize based on that. But there's obviously another factor that plays a role in how any character in Diablo plays, and that is what kind of gear you have equipped. The loot and gear system in Diablo 4 is one of the more perplexing parts of the game to me, in more ways than one. In any game that's centered around collecting more and more loot, I've oftentimes felt overwhelmed at the endless amount of items that you can find and equip, and it's certainly no different here. The early game in particular is affected by this abundance of gear, and it ends up creating a peculiar cycle that arguably harms the experience. Enemies in Diablo 4 drop loot in pretty much every encounter, and early on, this loot typically is going to scale just a bit higher than what you currently have equipped. This is, of course, part of the appeal to loot-based games, as it creates that feeling of consistently acquiring more and more powerful gear, causing you to keep playing to find that next sword, amulet, or pair of boots that will be slightly better than the last. In theory, that cycle sounds satisfying, and it is to certain parts of the brain. In practice, though, this system can feel incredibly disruptive to the flow of, the actual game. In the early stages of Diablo 4, when every single item you pick up is 3 or 4 points above your last one, and when you have up to 11 types of items you can equip, you end up stopping after every encounter to swap out one piece of gear for the next for what is ultimately negligible and, I would argue, imperceptible gains. And early on, I definitely fell victim to this, wanting to make sure that I had the best available items equipped, no matter how minor the improvement was. This cycle potentially could result in a gratifying experience if each new piece of gear you equipped made some sort of significant change. A major increase in attack power, a noticeable improvement to health regeneration, a special ability specific to that item, which we'll later see with legendary powers. But instead what we get is the typical old school RPG affair of tiny percentage boosts to a myriad of stats, the vast majority of which you will never notice in the heat of battle. The constant stream of slightly improved loot you gain also affects the shop systems in the game. Up through this point in my playthrough, I found myself not purchasing a single item from any vendor because I knew that item would almost immediately become obsolete upon my next venture into the world. So I ended up just hoarding gold dropped from battles, stockpiling useless items that I sold for gold, and then letting that gold sit in my wallet because there was nothing worth purchasing. Like, am I doing something wrong here? Listen, I get that what I'm talking about is kind of at the core of any game focused on loot, and specifically Diablo games. But to me, this type of system has been outdated and outperformed by other games for literal decades. This is why things like skill trees exist and ultimately replaced minor stat boosts in traditional level up systems, because they deliver a power progression that actually feels significant with every step. I don't know what the answer to this is, but I also admittedly haven't played a lot of these games. So if you've experienced one that does a better job of providing satisfying gear progression that doesn't feel so disruptive to the flow of the gameplay, please let me know in the comments. Fortunately, I pretty quickly threw away the mindset I'm describing, instead choosing to collect as much loot as I could, but waiting completely until I was outright finished with whatever dungeon I was in, or until I made my way back to a town to even open my inventory to look at what I had gathered. This is a single decision that honestly has a major impact on the experience, and it's one I would recommend for any new player. It feels akin to decisions like turning off the minimap or waypoint markers in other games, which you cannot do in Diablo 4 for some reason. That map is painted to the corner of your screen whether you want it there or not. Maybe we'll get that option in an update, but for now, deliberately choosing to ignore what loot you've gained is a liberating choice that frees you from worrying so much about inventory and gear and allows you to determine when you want to interact with that part of the game. Ultimately, especially at this point in the game, I ended up just equipping items with the highest overall power value and all but ignoring any other ancillary benefits and buffs associated with them. And I think the important takeaway here is that you truly can play the game that way and it is still perfectly enjoyable. Am I missing out on a piece here that I would gain from min-maxing all of my equipment decisions? Possibly, but I think what I gain in sanity and stress reduction is more than worth the risk. Somewhere around 7 hours into the game, I ventured into the Skazglin region. At about 10 hours, I reached the Dry Steppes. I've still been having a good time roaming around and beating down enemies with my barbarian. I don't know how the other classes play, but there's definitely something satisfying about being able to bum rush into a fight without a care, knowing that I can handle any close-range enemy with the swing of an axe. Throughout this time, I encountered only a couple of minor bugs. Enemies occasionally spawn in areas they're not supposed to, or freeze in place and become unable to be interacted with. I've been disconnected from the server a couple of times, which was actually on my end, but anytime I was disconnected, the game would also crash and shut down entirely rather than kicking me out to the main menu. There was one area where voice lines for a quest I hadn't yet found would keep triggering as I walked through its general vicinity, which was real confusing the first time I encountered this.
Let's see what you can do.
Other than those few issues, Diablo 4 runs really well. Stuttering and frame rate drops exist, but I'm actually surprised at how little they happen, simply based on how many times there are a multitude of enemies and effects happening on screen at once. And this isn't a case of sacrificing fidelity for performance, because this is still a very good-looking game. The darker art style, I presume, is something appreciated by many fans of the older Diablo games. And although the constantly grim atmosphere it presents isn't going to be for everyone, there's no denying that it's certainly well made and makes good use of its most important stylistic features. Fractured Peaks, the game's introductory region, is nearly entirely covered in snow, but there's still so much environmental variety present throughout it that you wouldn't be surprised to see a full game take place here. From blistering cold tundras to rocky cliffsides to scattered villages filled with residents trying to stay warm, it's clear the developers took great care in crafting their world and creating a look that emphasizes the distressing nature of this environment. You can imagine then how much of a change of pace it feels like when you wander into Skazglen, the rolling countryside to the north soaked in persistent rainfall. The same can be said, probably even more so, when you find yourself in the dry steppes, a unique combination of arid climates that completely contrast with the first two regions. Every area in Diablo 4 is certainly visually distinct, but the bleak and grisly art style still looms over them all, creating a sense of visual cohesion and letting you know that no matter how far you travel, you're still just a few underground tunnels from the gates of hell. You'd be forgiven to assume that this relentlessly depressing visual style, coupled with gameplay that's repetitive in nature, means that the game's world would eventually become burdensome on the player. In fact, this was one of my main concerns going into the game. And perhaps eventually this becomes the case, but during my time with it, Diablo 4 presents so many different types of environments that nearly all of them felt like a fresh experience. A lot of this is owed to the tremendous amount of small details present in the game's more curated areas, a feature that you wouldn't necessarily expect from a game that utilizes this type of top-down camera angle. I have really enjoyed visually striking moments like walking through the game's major cities and recognizing the soft purple glow of each one's occultist shop, a consistent and familiar sight no matter where I've ended up that day. Or standing at the Barbarian's bonfire in Ked Bardu, with 3 different sources of light all illuminating the environment in a distinct way. Or stumbling into the house of a demon worshipper and finding their makeshift altars and shrines often covered in sacrificial blood. Diablo 4 would have still existed and functioned well without these small touches, but they add so much to the world that after seeing how things can be, it would feel empty without them. This is also a game that utilizes a day and night cycle with remarkable effectiveness. I don't know how they did it or how exactly to describe it, but the difference between walking through the exact same environment in both the daytime and the nighttime is more distinct than almost any game I can remember. Perhaps what's most interesting is that the visual accomplishments in Diablo 4 also directly affected my experience with the gameplay, because I would almost always find myself spending more time exploring and completing quests in the open world than I would in the game's many dungeons and other sub-areas. It was just a more interesting environment to me. But even in those areas, time was taken to ensure that the player's experience was not an entirely repetitive one, as there's an admirable amount of variety and detail found within them. And yes, the dungeons you'll find are often the traditional dark caves or decrepit underground tunnels, but they also could see you running through the halls of an extravagantly ornate monastery, or maneuvering your way through the thick of a gloomy forest, among other things. So Diablo 4 is a great example of a game that not only looks good, but also leverages its art direction and visual style to enhance the player's experience. And speaking of enhancing the player's experience, we'll talk about how the sound design accomplishes this same thing in a minute. But first, I want to briefly get back to how my personal journey is going at this point in the game, because on day 11, I found turtles. The game continues to impress me with the number of ways it allows you to approach combat, even within a single class. At this point, I've made multiple changes to my build, sometimes swapping out single skills for others, and other times doing a hard reset, completely changing the combat theory around which I want to build my character. I've since gained access to ultimate abilities, which have been a nice addition. My favorite by far being the Call of the Ancients, which for a few seconds summons 3 spirits of past barbarians to help you deal mass amounts of damage. The whole sequence feels like when you get lucky on a good Pokeball in Super Smash Bros. And end up just annihilating the rest of the field. It's a chaotic scene with each character doling out a unique attack, but if you think I'm able to determine what's going on with these different types of damage to strategize around them, you're kidding yourself. At least for my purposes, this is simply a flashy DPS attack at its finest. I'm having a little trouble keeping track of special abilities I've gained access to, as the game embeds them across multiple different systems, including equipable items, your skill tree, and aspects, which are special abilities you can apply to certain pieces of gear. So for example, around hour 24, I applied a modifier to my ground stomp skill that reduces the cooldown of my ultimate ability. I also coincidentally picked up a piece of legendary gear that creates an earthquake in the area of my ground stomp, dealing additional damage to enemies around me. Then I completed a dungeon that gave me access to the aspect of perpetual stomping. Yeah, that's its real name, which resets the cooldown of my leap ability every time ground stomp is used. So you can start to see the synergy practically boiling over with a combination like this, and I was super excited that I happened to fall into all these pieces to the puzzle in such close proximity to each other. The only problem was when I went back to fuse these modifiers together, I had sort of forgotten which skill came from the item, which one was found on the skill tree, and which one was part of the aspect. Oh, and I didn't actually know how to apply aspects to items yet, so that didn't help either. This was really just a minor setback, if anything, and sort of just comes with the territory of integrating cross-functional systems like this. I actually think this way of doing things is pretty cool, since it directly leads to elaborate puzzle piecing of all these different options to experiment with more complex and potentially more powerful builds. The reason I'm documenting it is more because this was one of the rare times during my playthrough that I could see beginners potentially being held back by not having the required knowledge or patience to maximize synergies across interacting systems. But when you do get lucky on combinations like this, it really does lead to some fun combat encounters as you tear through enemies by stringing together sequences of these overlapping abilities. Features like this keep fights engaging and help them to feel more satisfying, a feeling that's also elevated by the game's intense sound design, which during combat is really cranked up to 11. Attacks have distinct, impactful sound effects that help you feel like you're really landing your blows. The various shouts the barbarian belts out have a fierce energy to them, strengthening the aggressive identity of the character. And sound effects that serve as signals, like when you use a healing potion or when you deal a finishing blow with a particular ability, crisply stand out from the rest of the mix. The results of this are battles that have a great sense of weight to them, each one feeling like a jolt of stimulating energy. And it's maybe too much of a jolt, in fact, because the one problem here is that the sound effect volume by default is cranked up so high it feels like it's smashing your eardrums with every hit. You can be playing at a volume where everything else sounds great. Music, ambient sounds, voiceover, all good. Then you enter a fight and suddenly there is just a massive increase in decibel level. Fortunately, this is an easy fix in the options menu, and once you adjust it, you're good to go. But these sound effects were so jarringly loud that I had to turn them down to 60% or less of their normal volume. That's not exactly a minor adjustment. There's an occurrence that happens in sound mixing where we will perceive things that are louder to sound better. This is the only possible explanation I can think of for why these sound effects are turned up so much, as the developers really lean hard into wanting to make your combat experience feel palpable. But I think they went a little too hard trying to achieve this, and for a game that nails most other things in the sound department, it's puzzling to see a misstep like this. The only other issue I had with the sound in Diablo 4 is the awkward delivery of many voice lines during in-game conversations. There are frequently noticeable pauses between different characters speaking, almost as if they left a tail of dead air at the end of each audio file and the next one isn't able to trigger until the first one finishes.
Apologies. He also gave me this amulet.
I've noticed this in plenty of other games, so I don't know, there obviously must be a reason for this happening that I'm not aware of, but it is particularly apparent in Diablo 4, which is just kind of baffling to me considering the amount of time and money that went into this game's development. Like, this really feels like something that should have been cleaned up. The unfortunate part is that Diablo 4 actually puts a lot of effort into its storyline and character interactions. It features voice work that ranges from decent to really great, and it's clear the developers wanted to use this aspect of the game to add depth to the player's connection with Diablo's world. But this seemingly small issue just completely pulled me out of that immersion because instead of caring about what these characters were saying, I was too busy wondering why it constantly sounded like I was watching scenes from a live play in which all the actors forgot their lines before suddenly remembering and blurting them out.
I should return swiftly. But, Sister Octavia, please.
So, kind of disappointing. I know story, cutscenes, and character development are not why most people play Diablo games, but this part feels like a miss. Fortunately though, the rest of the soundwork in Diablo 4 is actually really great. It features a score that does a fantastic job of knowing its value as a subdued backing track to your adventures. There are no overly discernible themes or distinct breaks between tracks trying to differentiate themselves, just an unobtrusive collection of atmospheric music that consistently hums in the background. This is honestly essential in a game like this where you'll be spending hours grinding away in the same areas, and the developers and composers are obviously keenly aware of that. Ambient sound effects play the same role, subtle enough that you may not even notice many of them, when in reality they're hard at work deftly enhancing the atmosphere of the world around you. If you want to try something cool, turn off the music in the options and just walk around one of the game's cities for a while with the ambient sound effects still on. You'll quickly notice fires crackling, wind blowing, bottles clinking, and wood creaking, and appreciate how much they add to making the many areas in Sanctuary feel like a real place. In the end, Diablo 4's sound design is definitely more of a win than a loss, with the few unusual missteps not enough to detract from the outstanding work done with the score, the quality of sound effects, and the way both of those pieces work together to enhance the player's experience, even after 28 hours and counting. Day 17. Today I passed the 2 million mark in gold collected and still haven't purchased a single item. If you've been watching with a keen eye, you may have noticed that I've been playing Diablo 4 on World Tier 1, essentially the lowest difficulty. Not essentially, it is the lowest difficulty. Before you scoff at this decision, you should take note that this is the recommended level for beginners, a word that is literally in the title of this video. And truthfully, up to a certain point in the game, this was definitely the right choice. Tier 1 doesn't present much of a challenge in the way that you constantly feel threatened, but it's still engaging enough that you can't sleepwalk through it either. I died only a few times on this level, I think mostly just from forgetting to pay attention to my health pool, but other than that I never really felt like the game's difficulty was getting in my way, and that's exactly what I wanted for the beginning stages of my experience. My goal throughout this playthrough was to deliberately put time into learning the game and discovering what makes the Diablo formula tick. Playing on World Tier 1 certainly allowed me to do that, and honestly, I also just had a great time storming through enemies with relative ease. But there did eventually come a time when I was ready for more of a challenge. Around level 45, I bumped the difficulty up to Tier 2, and fortunately, this also felt like the right decision at the right time. I noticed an immediate difference, due also in part to the fact that I had just swapped my build out for a moveset that I wasn't at all familiar with. Good timing, I know. But after a brief adjustment period, I settled right back into the flow of crushing hordes of demons, cannibals, and wild animals. What I found really interesting about this change in difficulty levels is that it ended up having a pretty substantial impact on the depth of gameplay in a way I didn't necessarily expect. See, it's not the increased enemy health or the more robust rewards you get for handling them that makes this higher tier more compelling. It's the way it forces you to now consider potion management as an active mechanic during combat. So to be clear, potions are available and ready to be used in Tier 1. It's just that you don't really need them that much. I rarely ever found myself having to actively apply potions in the heat of battle, instead usually just topping off my health after I had taken out a wave or two of foes. But with enemies who are now more of a consistent threat to drain your life total, this mechanic changes quite a bit. During fights in Tier 1, I could focus completely on the combat itself, determining which skills to use and when, properly positioning myself and evading oncoming attacks, managing the relationship between my Fury resource and my core abilities that relied upon it. During fights in Tier 2, this isn't necessarily the case, as enemies are simply dealing more damage on a regular basis. So now, in addition to moving and dashing around, pressing different keys for each attack or buff, and building my Fury while simultaneously remembering cooldown timings, I also had to constantly monitor my health pool and apply potions at the most optimal times. On paper, this sounds like an obvious point, but I'm telling you, the way it's blended into Diablo's hectic combat really makes a difference, and it was cool experiencing this change. World Tiers 3 and 4 are locked until you finish the main campaign, which I have not yet done, so I can't comment on how much those levels up the challenge, though I'll certainly be giving them a shot when I'm able. If I could go back, I probably would have made the switch to Tier 2 a little sooner, as it feels like the true representation of how Diablo 4 is meant to be played. But considering by the time I'm writing this script I have not even finished Act 3 of the story, there's still plenty of time to experience the game that way. One part of the game's difficulty that I'm not thrilled with is the boss encounters. Don't get me wrong, I think mechanically a lot of them are really cool. After spending hours fighting off hordes of enemies that are generally quite similar to one another, experiencing a boss fight during which they actually have different attack patterns, special abilities, and unique hazards is a welcome addition. The problem I have with the bosses is that they oftentimes just have too much HP. Long after I feel like I've cracked the code to each of these bosses and start dodging their attacks and setting up my own sequence of damage, it often feels like I'm just forced to do that over and over again due to the sponginess of these enemies. I'm a big believer that simply increasing the health pool of enemies is not a valid way to increase difficulty, and Diablo 4 is a perfect example of why that is. Because once you figure these bosses out, their mass amounts of hit points don't make them any more challenging, they just make them take longer to finish off. And if you have a build that caters to dishing out AoE damage or dealing with many enemies at once, which is like 90% of what you encounter in this game, you're actually at a disadvantage in boss fights because you simply don't have enough single target DPS at your disposal and have to slowly whittle down their health over an exaggerated period of time. So as I mentioned at the top of this video, my entire playthrough so far has been riding solo, so I don't know if the silly amounts of HP scale to the number of people around you, and if boss fights are just as tedious with a group or what. I don't know how that works, so if you feel like leaving a comment to answer that question, feel free. This hasn't been the case with all bosses, but the times it does happen, I can't help but just see the word padding streak across my mind as I chip away at these overly robust enemies. The other thing I noticed is that most bosses seem to be frequently immune to your abilities that deal effects like stuns or knockbacks. Again, this rarely ever feels like a satisfying way to make a fight more difficult, and in fact it makes them less enjoyable because your full arsenal of moves that you've been working on perfecting suddenly becomes stripped down and way less powerful, effectively causing you to rely solely on the damage component of your attacks. I know that a lot of games utilize bosses with immunities, but I think that is very much a case of how pervasive game design does not necessarily equal quality game design. In the end, these swings in difficulty, if you want to call it that, didn't bother me too much. It certainly didn't dissuade me from continuing to play the game, something that I think is pretty relevant to all of the flaws in Diablo 4 that I've mentioned so far. I should probably make it clear that I didn't just force myself through 40 hours of monster slaying just to make a video about it. I did it because I was consistently hooked by what this game had to offer. So to balance things out for a minute, here are some things that I've really enjoyed about Diablo 4 that I've noticed as I continue my third week of daily playtime. Let's start with an update on the depth of combat systems. Fighting enemies in Diablo 4 is making the logical part of my brain hurt, because realistically, this combat should have become a bore hours ago. But there is consistent, if sometimes slow-moving, progress that allows you to frequently change, upgrade, and modify your character, creating the opportunity for new ways to approach each fight. As I've worked my way through level 40 and beyond, I've gotten more and more frequent legendary drops, something that can significantly alter the way you play depending on which items you choose to equip. When I found a legendary helm that added 2 additional charges to my weapon mastery skills, you can bet that I quickly opened up my skill tree to find out how I could best utilize it. Another great example, I don't think I messed with single-handed weapons, like at all, until day 18, when I finally started looking into perks that came from swapping weapons, something that can end up providing a lot of extra damage if managed correctly. As I mentioned previously, the cool part about this is that it's not at all required. As a barbarian, you could do a full playthrough exclusively using double-handed weapons, but the options and extrapolations are there and available for you to take advantage of if you're interested in that level of depth. This fluidity present throughout Diablo 4's character builds is one of the most fun parts of the game. Even still, at this many hours in, I can't stress enough how glad I am that I didn't follow a build guide or an outside resource to help guide me in this process. I can't speak for veterans of this genre, but if you're a beginner like me, I think this is without a doubt the route to take. You truly can go at your own pace, make your own discoveries, and play the way you want to, even if it's not what is considered most optimal. And truthfully, I've never really been a most optimal kind of person when it comes to games, so I'm grateful that Diablo 4 provides me with this freedom to mix things up. How about the smart implementation of an open world that doesn't feel like an overwhelming list of tasks despite its immense scope? Diablo 4 keeps track of your overall world progress through its Renown tab, which tallies accomplishments like areas discovered, altars found, and dungeons completed, among other things. This isn't too different from other open world games, but it is interesting how keeping this information on a very unassuming section of the map screen and rewarding you for uncovering a certain percentage of these finds makes things feel a little more important when you reach a new level of Renown. The game also recognizes your efforts here by providing you with meaningful benefits like awarding a new skill point or an additional potion to your inventory. In doing so, what feels like a simple checklist in other games instead becomes something that you can purposefully work towards, rewarding the player for their exploration of the game's vast world. And finally, I'd like to praise the different sources from which your quests, side quests, and other means of finding things to do come from. This is something that I noticed pretty early on, but it's a feature that I honestly think is crucial to Diablo's ability to carry players into the later stages of the game while keeping them engaged. There's a tremendous balance among traditional dungeons, cellars, strongholds, side quests, and random events within the open world. All of these elements serve their own unique purpose, each one offering the player different types of rewards, challenges, and perhaps most importantly, time commitments. So if you're ready for more of a substantial play, the campaign missions or the dungeons are the way to go. If you're just spending some casual time playing the game, you can roam the world and see what cellars you find or what events you run into. And if you want something in the middle that makes an actual impact on the world around you, try conquering one of the game's many strongholds. And I do want to highlight these strongholds specifically because I really appreciate how noticeable the impact of completing one of these challenges is. I don't know if it's due to how dreary and hopeless these areas are when you initially discover them and how they're totally transformed into lively and useful waypoints for your journey afterwards, but there's something about strongholds in Diablo 4 that feel a lot more meaningful than similar areas in other open world games. Quest design isn't perfect, however, as there are a couple things that I feel hold Diablo 4 back a bit in this area as it clings to certain parts of its old school action RPG roots. Let's retrace our steps a little bit, all the way back to day 4, because it's here when I first made a note about what I thought might be a lack of autonomy when it comes to making decisions in this game. Here's what I wrote in full. I don't expect a lot of choice and consequence in this game, but it's strange how you have no say in most things. Side quests are automatically accepted, characters will join your party without you agreeing to it, every action seems to be completely out of your control. Now, as we fast forward again, closing in on 40 hours of Diablo 4, I can confirm this quote holds pretty much exactly true. When you interact with a character who has a side quest available, well, hope you didn't want to say no because your character will respond with some version of
I'll look into it
every single time. I can't remember the last RPG I played that didn't at least give me the option to decline assignments if I wanted to. The quests that involve NPCs accompanying you is especially weird, as they literally just start following you around immediately following the conversation. Like, who are you, dude? Now, you are able to go into your log and forget these quests, basically resetting them, but it's just so strange that that's the default option to handle this. The more significant aspect of this, though, is that you have absolutely no say in how you approach any objective in the game, meaning your character and their interactions with everyone in the world play out exactly and only how they are written. Always, every time. This is true of both campaign missions and side content, so if you don't feel like being a character that follows the light and buys into being anything but a virtuous hero in this game's narrative, well, suck it up because that's not up to you. There was a moment that stuck out to me when I encountered a prisoner in a cage who you find out is sentenced to be burned alive. Upon talking to this character, all the guard watching him says is,
Confess and seek grace in the light.
but then there's no follow-up to that. There's no option to persuade the guard to let the prisoner go or to fight the guard and free the man yourself. There's no conversation path that allows you to convince the prisoner to confess in hopes of lessening his sentence. There's no opportunity to do some detective work and look into whether or not the prisoner even committed the crime he's accused of. You literally just walk away from this conversation being like, well, alright, I guess you're fucking dead, man. I mean, Dragon Age Origins found a better way to approach this scenario 14 years ago. And I say all this as someone who is very much not a true role player in role-playing games. I don't need to feel like I'm diving into the identity and motivations of my character. I just want to feel like I have some level of autonomy and decision-making ability. Diablo 4 doesn't present you with any of that, and when you look at how far games have come in this regard, it's disappointing to see such a high-profile project not make any attempt at it. So a question I always ask myself when looking at flaws in games is, how much does this impact the overall experience? Do these downfalls really matter that much? Or are they just minor annoyances, or a disconnect between preferences and product? In the case of Diablo 4, the answer is probably somewhere in between. As I mentioned, the lack of choice and consequence in this game was apparent from the early stages. This is something you learn at hour 5, not hour 50. And similar to the flaws that affect the loot system, or the voice editing, or the boss battles, this blemish wasn't enough to dampen my experience enough to make me not want to play. But I will say that this is the one factor that I think would have enhanced the game the most had it been implemented in some way. It's a piece that perhaps could have evolved Diablo 4 from an exciting, polished, addictive dungeon crawler into something really memorable. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised to see this detail be the focal point of development on Diablo 5. But that's like, what, 15 years out? So see you back here in 2038. I still have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm getting better. As I finish this leg of my Diablo 4 journey, I've reached level 48, cleared 10 dungeons and 5 strongholds, completed 39 side quests, and have not quite but nearly concluded Act 3 of the campaign. I've undoubtedly experienced quite a bit, but at the same time I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of some of the deeper components to this hefty game. So at this current stopping point, I wanted to highlight a few things that I feel like I've learned enough about to move on from my previous label of complete beginner. The ability to create a customized and effective character build. Diablo 4's system for building and modifying your character is flexible and forgiving for beginners. The skill tree is organized in a way that's easy enough to understand, and throughout just 40 hours, I was able to experiment with several different types of builds and variants. Most importantly, nearly every type of build I tried was viable for a casual player. An understanding of the loot system and most of the ways to upgrade it. As I mentioned before, this is one of the parts of the game I was most hesitant about, as it easily has the potential to get overwhelming quickly. That can still be the case, but with a slight change in mindset, I was able to treat Diablo 4's loot system as something that could work for me and not the other way around. I don't think I'd be nearly as intimidated going into a similar action RPG now that I have a better grasp on how this all works. Quest types and their reward structure. There's a formula to all the different types of quests in Diablo 4, each one following a specific structure and offering a corresponding reward. While this can make things predictable at times, it also makes the blueprint easy to learn and allows the player to choose what type of quests they want to engage with and when. So the flow of how to move throughout Diablo 4's world and content becomes manageable pretty quickly, despite the tremendous scope of it all. Okay, to follow that up, here are some things that I've been exposed to, but haven't yet become fully proficient in. True optimization of builds and a complete understanding of skill interactions. There's a difference between creating a viable build and creating one that truly maximizes the potential of your character, and that's something I haven't gotten a feel for just yet. The sheer amount of minor buffs found on equipment could theoretically be synergized, but it's just not something I'm interested in doing. There's also a great deal of skill combinations I haven't even tried yet, and that's just for one character class. Some people love experimenting with and perfecting this part of the game. Others may not care at all. I'm probably somewhere in between, but either way it'll take me a while to get fully comfortable with it. The full world and all it has to offer. As of this writing, I've explored quite a bit of Fractured Peaks, a decent chunk of Skazglin and Dry Steppes, and I'm just now beginning to work my way through Kyrgyzstan. This means I haven't even touched the map's 5th main region, and of all the space I have explored, I'm not even close to finishing all of the many quests, dungeons, hidden shrines, and other content available in them. There is a lot to do in this game, and when I added up my total numbers, I was actually surprised at how little I had completed so far. The complete story and its place in Diablo's lore. I stopped my part of this playthrough somewhere near the end of Act 3. I don't know how the length of each act varies, but that basically means that I'm not even halfway through the campaign. Obviously, I've been spending a lot of my time doing things outside of the story missions, which is typically how I approach a lot of open world games on the front end of the experience. It'll be interesting to see how my criticisms of the lack of choices the game provides you end up affecting my thoughts on the main narrative overall as I continue to progress. How the game is monetized. Okay, I'm only going to touch on this briefly because I don't think there's anything I can say that hasn't already been said elsewhere. I spent $70 on this game at launch, and it'll remain that price for a good while. That's a lot of money, but this is a game that's been in development for years, cost millions of dollars, and has had hundreds of people working on it, so I get it. Keep in mind this is not a broken, barren game release either. There's a ton of existing content, and what is in there is really polished. But then there's also an in-game shop in which you can purchase cosmetics, which I have not touched and don't plan on doing so. Even if you're the type that loves new skins and new looks, I don't think I'm alone in saying that some of the prices found in this shop are outrageous. There is also, at least currently, no way to earn any of these cosmetics in-game at all. If you want them, you have to spend real money on them. In addition to that, the game offers a paid battle pass for its newly launched seasonal structure. So, okay, if people want to see continued content for the game, they've got to make money from that somehow. There are arguments to be made for all three of these ways to monetize a game, but for me, asking full price plus for the base game, using a paid battle pass every few months, and charging players insulting amounts of money for a cosmetic or skin, yeah, that feels kind of scummy. And it is. Lastly, here are some pieces of the game that I haven't even touched yet. The Paragon tab and its effects on your character. This tab opens at level 50, so I'm 2 levels away from unlocking it. And it's totally blocked off, like you can't even click on it to preview what's there, so I'm not kidding, I literally have no idea what this is or how it affects your character. By the time this video gets released, I'll for sure have cruised past that threshold, so it'll be interesting to find out if this is something that drastically changes character builds, or if it's just a new system to provide some sense of progression as your skill tree gets closer to being maxed out. Whatever awaits in the end game. Yeah, I mean, not a lot to say here. I'm not anywhere close to approaching the end game, and to be totally honest with you, I'm not even sure what that entails. Again, I know that this is the type of stuff that a lot of people strive for in Diablo games, but I'm really not sure I'm even all that interested. I've enjoyed my time with the game so far and will continue to enjoy it at my own pace for my own purposes. And the important part to remember is that you can absolutely play Diablo 4 in that more casual sort of sense and still get your money's worth. All of the other classes and how their respective playstyles pan out. So this is a big one, right? I've been very impressed with how varied and versatile the Barbarian class has been, something that's particularly striking considering this is typically a class of character that's considered more user-friendly than most. But because of the depth behind my experience, I've actually only become even more intrigued by what the other classes have to offer. It's hard for me to imagine I won't at least try out most of those classes, if even just to satisfy that curiosity. Of all of the pieces I have yet to experience in Diablo 4, this is the one that is the most motivating to me to continue my time with it. So my goal with this video was to detail and document what Diablo 4 is like from the perspective of a total beginner. My hope for the video is that you've gained something from following along, whether that means learning a thing or two as a fellow novice, or re-experiencing some of that Diablo magic as a veteran, or just enjoying your time listening to me fumble around trying to explain concepts I was previously unfamiliar with. I'm confident that I've accomplished my goal. I'll leave it up to you to let me know if I've accomplished my hope as well. There's a lot of things that were special about experiencing this series for the first time. And even though I've had my eye on the Diablo games for years, I couldn't be happier that this was the entry I chose to dive into. I can't imagine that Diablo has ever felt better or been more accessible than it is now. And that's a testament to a development process that respected the wants of series vets while also identifying the needs of series newcomers. I think it's easy for players familiar with this genre to somewhat mindlessly cruise through this game, trying to level up as quickly as possible and not necessarily taking moments to stop and smell the blood-covered petals. I feel fortunate to sort of have been forced to not approach the game that way, taking my time to learn new systems, to admire and appreciate the detailed environments, and to discover for the first time the depressingly beautiful world at work here. And if there's one thing that Diablo 4 achieves, it's re-establishing that world as one that sits atop the throne of relentlessly bleak gaming experiences. So to close things out, I'd like to counteract that bleakness just a bit by describing what so far has been my favorite quest in the entire game. In an area called Under the Fat Goose Inn, you'll speak to the innkeeper who tasks you with finding a couple of local troublemakers who have stolen his sign outside the inn. He speaks about these two in a somewhat frustrated manner, but also recognizes them as familiar members of the community. As you make your way east into the countryside beyond the inn, you soon run into one of these characters, Nairn, sitting on the edge of a cliffside right next to the goose-shaped sign you're seeking. But Tavish, her partner in crime, is nowhere to be seen. He's been killed by a group of monsters called the Goatmen. So you converse with Nairn for a bit, and she agrees to give you back the sign to the inn if you'll accompany her on a list of last deeds that her and Tavish have always wanted to accomplish before they died. You agree, of course, and the two of you go off into the dreary surroundings to take care of these 3 tasks. None of the deeds you complete in this quest are any more unique or interactive than any other goal you'll come across during your time in this game. They all simply require going to a specific area, fighting off some enemies, and then generically interacting with an object in the space. But from the very onset of this mission, the help you're providing feels emotionally more significant than other quests due to the feeling of heartache you develop for this random character in Diablo's world. To her, this list of last deeds holds something of great importance, no matter how trivial or how dangerous it may be. And the most remarkable part of all of this is that Nairn has nothing but a contagiously positive attitude throughout the whole ordeal. At every step, rather than falling into a dark place due to the death of her friend, or the monstrous enemies, or the oppressive environment, she instead chooses to see this quest as one final adventure. Despite every attempt by this world to crush her under its pressure, her commitment to the memory of her friend never wavers.
I'm going to stay a while longer and finish this last pint with Tavish. Just one more.
Moments like this are exceedingly rare in Diablo 4. They're an unexpected but welcome respite from what is otherwise a dark and dismal experience. But their scarcity also reflects the high-value impression they leave on the player. In a game that consistently tries to bring you down through its environments, through its enemies, through its storyline, the unshakable optimism of Nairn and the few others like her provide the player with something to fight for, again and again, as you continue to make your trek towards a battle with the unrelenting forces of heaven and hell. And if that doesn't do it for you, there's also one where you find a goat you think is dead, but it turns out he just ate too much salt and fell asleep. So that one's pretty good too. Hey, thanks for watching. This was a pretty massive undertaking for a channel of this size, so if you enjoyed your time here, do me a favor and like this video and subscribe if you're really into this stuff. If you'd like to see a follow-up documenting the next leg of my Diablo 4 journey, let me know in the comments below. I know I will at the very least be finishing the game's campaign with this character, but after that, I don't know. Is it worth it to keep going with the same class to reach later game content? Or should I try a brand new character in a completely different class? Feel free to provide any thoughts on those questions, and I'll see you next time.